This whole data center debacle is getting kind of out of control, y'all. And this is a very hot topic for good reason, because there are a lot of people out there that are noticing that the common narrative that we're being fed, the math ain't mathing. Stuff is simply not adding up. There's something seriously off about these data centers. There's something seriously off about what we're being told and what seems to be the reality. And that has left me looking for answers. So I have scoured the web and I've taken a lot of notes. I've got a lot of notes right here. You know it's getting serious when I bust out the notebook. But I want to share with you what I found, because not only is what I found kind of shocking, it also just doesn't add up. Because there are a lot of contradictions. And when I say contradictions, I mean contradictions in pretty much everything that we've been told over the last couple of decades to now. I mean, this is pretty baffling. And I also want to say that this is just for entertainment purposes only. Wink, wink. Because I also scoured the internet for what the people are saying. Because it's one thing to just look at the raw data and the information that's put out to the public. And it's an entirely different thing to kind of poll the people and listen to what the communities are saying. Because that's where the real story is painted. Because each individual person also does their own research, and a lot of people are involved in some of this stuff, and they're dealing with some of this stuff firsthand. So when you take all that into account, the actual picture starts to reveal itself, and the picture is pretty wild. I would consider a form of modern art, one of those deals where the painting's there and you're looking at it and it's so abstract that you can't really make sense of it. But when it's explained to you and you start to see the parallels and the connections between all the individual pieces of that artwork, the entire image begins to come into focus. So without further ado, we're just going to dive into this, and we're going to start off with several reasons on why this stuff is not really adding up. So the first reason is simply the scale of how many data centers are here specifically in the United States. This is a big one. This does not make sense, okay? Because right now in the US, there are around 5,500 data centers. And the number is kind of unknown, actually, because we're going to get into this, but there's a lot of secrecy around these data centers. Nobody's really disclosing where they're all at, how many are being built, how many are forecasted to be built. So it's kind of a best guess. And a lot of the data centers that are pinned on a lot of these maps and stuff I looked at are the community telling these people that are running these maps where these data centers are at. But by 2030, that number 5,500 is supposed to more than double. Now currently in the world, there are already over 12,000. But the reason this gets kind of crazy and it doesn't really make sense is because I looked at all the other countries and how many data centers these other countries have. And the amount that we have here compared to everywhere else on the planet is shocking. Okay, so the next behind us is Great Britain. They have around 500. Okay, Germany, they have around 470. China, they have around 450. And supposedly, they're right behind us in terms of AI development. So how does that really make sense? One of the countries that is one of the most developed in the world, that is right behind the United States, only has 450, yet we have over 5,500. And then the fourth place in this whole thing is France, and they have 335. So we have, I mean, more than 10x the next country behind us in terms of how many data centers we have. And another crazy thing about this is that it's not like our population is greater than, say, China, for example, because they supposedly have billions of people in their country, or over 1 billion people, I think it is. And we have, what, 324 million? Yet we have 5,500 data centers and they only have 450. So that really doesn't make sense. And when you go by the common theme and the common narrative on why they're building these data centers, obviously it's for AI. But the common narrative says that the person or the country that achieves artificial intelligence, and let's say AGI, artificial general intelligence or super intelligence, they basically win the game. They will have military supremacy over the entire world, And that is the big reason why they're scaling it up so much. And then the other common narrative that is not really mainstream, but that one talks about surveillance. They want to make a, surveillance state and a police state. Neither one of those narratives makes sense because China, they already have a surveillance state. They already have artificial intelligence, using biometrics and scanning people's faces. They have cameras all over the entire country. And they have the internet. They have technology that's just as advanced as ours. Yet somehow they only have 450 data centers. So that's the big thing, okay? But it gets even crazier from there, because let's also talk about the amount of money we're pouring into it. $7 trillion over the next 4 years, $10 trillion over the next 10 years. And they're doing that by going into savings accounts, pension accounts, 401ks, retirements, and even using insurance to basically extract money from the public. And they're using that to fund all of this AI infrastructure.
Much of this money, not just the private, is going to be coming from the private sector. From savings accounts, from pension accounts, from insurance companies, on and on and on.
And then we also have to take into account how big some of these data centers are, okay? And this is just a couple examples, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples just like this. But I found 4 of some of the biggest here in the country. And it's really wild when you think about this. Okay, so Stargate AI, which is a campus in Abilene, Texas, is 875 acres. All right, that is the size of New York City's Central Park. And there's a second major Stargate associated campus that's being developed in Shackelford County, Texas, which covers roughly 700 to 1,200 acres. And then, of course, after that, you have Meta's Hyperion AI Data Center campus, which is located in Richland Parish, Louisiana, and that is 4,000 acres. That is over 6 square miles. All right, so the scale is crazy, but it gets even crazier, because then we have Hypergrid Advanced Energy and Intelligence Campus in Amarillo, Texas. Also notice that a lot of these campuses and these giant data centers, even though they require to be very, very cool, and they should probably be in cold climates, they're in these very southern states where it's really hot and dry. That doesn't make sense either. But this one's in Amarillo, Texas, and it will span approximately 5,800 acres. And it is going to be powered with nuclear reactors, natural gas, solar, and battery storage. That's 18 million square foot of just warehouses for these AI data center server racks, all these computers and stuff they're putting in there. All right, the next one after that, and this is one of the biggest ones, this is Project Stratos. That is in Box Elder, Utah. This is Mr. Wonderful, the guy from Shark Tank. This is his data center. This one is supposed to be 40,000 acres, which is 62.5 square miles. Now, that is bigger than the entirety of Washington, D.C., and it is 3 times the size of Manhattan. There was so much pushback on this one that they actually decided to scale it back, and they cut the footprint in half, so it's now 20,000 acres, which is still 31 square miles. I mean, think about the size of that. It is insane. That it just doesn't add up, and we're going to get more into this, but it simply does not add up, okay? Because the buildings alone are going to take up 10,000 acres. That is 15.6 square miles of just buildings. We're not even talking about the compound itself. That is just building infrastructure. And then on top of that, they're talking about putting in an additional 3,000 acres of just solar panels. Originally, they were talking about doing another 40,000 acres of solar panels, and that was going to actually cover most of the Great Salt Lake, because they were going to float these panels, and it was going to take up 16% of the surface area of the entire lake. But apparently they scaled that down to 3,000 acres, which is still obviously a lot of acreage. And the environmental impacts from this, in a place that is already very dry and can get pretty hot, it is going to release as much heat as 23 atomic bombs every single day, and could raise the nighttime ambient temperature in this area anywhere from 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And another big reason none of this stuff really makes any sense is because they not only consume a tremendous amount of electricity, we're talking more electricity than entire states. For example, the one that's in Utah, before they scaled it back, it was going to consume more power than everything in the state of Utah combined. That is all infrastructure, all houses, everything. So think about that. Why is it that they're putting this much focus and this many of our resources into these data centers? What is the real reason for all this? And it's not just the electricity, it's also the water. And people are now saying that, well, they're going to move to these closed loop cooling systems, so they're going to use a lot less water. But the more I researched into this, the more the true story came out. And the true story is that, yes, they use less water, but there are two things in particular that nobody seems to be talking about. And the first thing is the fact that these closed loop systems actually use more electricity and more energy. So that means that the associated gas turbines could demand as much as 16.6 billion gallons annually, just from the turbines alone.
A data center can use water through a method called evaporative cooling, and that's where water is sort of pushed by fans through a membrane to bring down the temperature inside the server room. Those servers get really hot for the computer processing that they're doing, and that brings down the temperature in the room. When that method is used, more than half of that water can evaporate, and that's essentially what we call consumptive use. It's lost to the watershed. Whatever isn't evaporated is either discharged or it can be recirculated in the data center once it's cooled down. There are other methods of cooling. There's immersive cooling and direct-to-chip cooling, closed loop systems which use less water but have a higher electricity usage associated with them. When a data center uses more electricity than water, there's still water use associated with that if the data center is powered by fossil fuels or nuclear, because in that energy generation process, you also have consumptive use of water. Water's being used to cool turbines in those methods of energy generation.
And the other issue is that these closed loop cooling systems also have to have glycol and nitrates and all these additives added into the water. And that's all fine and dandy, but that system has to be cleaned every couple years because it calcifies, and the minerals that naturally occur in the water, they end up gumming up the components in that cooling system. And if you don't flush it out, it will end up clogging up. So what happens to all that waste when it's cleared out? Because glycol, which is basically antifreeze, and all the PFAs and stuff that are in that water cannot be easily cleaned from the water. So where does all that wastewater go? Are they just going to wash it downstream? Is it going to get pulled back up in the rain cycle and rain back down on all of us, contaminating the entire planet? These are all things we need to think about.
When I'm standing out here watering a tree and my neighbor's driving by and I'm drinking out of the hose, and he's like, hey, I wouldn't do that if I were you.
The neighbor warned him that the town's water was polluted with nitrates, a chemical that has been labeled as a carcinogen when in high levels.
There's a really bad groundwater pollution issue here with nitrate in groundwater, among some other things. And this being such a rural area up in Northeast Oregon, a lot of people rely disproportionately on their wells for their water supply. One of the most rapid industry growths that we're seeing in this area is data centers.
Since 2011, over 30 data centers have been built in the small town, with more on the way.
One of the concerns we have about that is data centers use a lot of water. They use it to keep their servers cool. And when they bring that water in, what we know from some of their permit applications and things like that is that they concentrate the contaminants in the water pretty substantially.
According to monthly facility monitoring reports, data centers in the Boardman area can use over 1 million gallons of water in a single month. But what do they do with it? These data centers run water through a pipe system to keep the rows and rows of servers cool. During this process, quite a bit of water evaporates, concentrating the chemicals and toxins that were already in the water to dangerous levels. Now considered waste, it's up to the Port of Morrow to safely dispose of it.
And all this water gets dumped on farmland around here. And because the farmland is so sandy and there's so much water that's so highly contaminated, it's sort of a perfect recipe for polluting the groundwater.
That polluted water, dense with nitrates, then seeps so far into the ground that wells become contaminated. Ingesting high levels of nitrate can prevent red blood cells from carrying appropriate levels of oxygen throughout the body and can cause reproductive complications, kidney and spleen disorders, and respiratory diseases. Jim Klipfel's well was tested for nitrates and came back at 52 milligrams per liter, over 5 times the legal limit of 10.
Whenever these data centers are put in place, they specifically choose areas that are rural. They choose areas that have natural water resources, aquifers, and lakes and streams and rivers, and that is because they use a tremendous amount of these resources.
Water might not be the first thing you think of when you think data centers, but most of them rely on lots of water to cool their systems. And that includes one coming to Piqua, here near Farrington and Washington roads, where 2 buildings will each be the size of 6 football fields. This water tower on the Kettering-Beaver Creek border holds 1 million gallons of water. Documents the I-Team reviewed show the company behind the data center in Piqua estimates it could use up to 2 of these, 2 million gallons every day. Mike Eckberg with the Miami Conservancy District says the Dayton region's water is reliant on a buried aquifer.
So we have constant exchange between the Great Miami River and the underlying aquifer. It's really all one water.
How important is it to protect that aquifer as a regional natural resource?
Well, this aquifer system, I mean, we're totally dependent on it for our drinking water. It's all we got.
Aside from the data center planned in Piqua, here in Sydney, Amazon is building a data center. According to datacentermap.com, Ohio is 5th in the country for the number of data centers.
Some of the data centers that are being sited around here, some of them are really good farmland. Not all of them, but some of them. So eventually that limits the use of production of agriculture commodities when you concrete these things over and build buildings.
And that's another big reason why none of this stuff is adding up, because for years and years we've been hearing about wildlife conservation. We got to preserve the environment, and we have to, save the trees, save the planet, save the water. But now we're facing a water crisis. And a lot of that is because these data centers are sucking up so much darn water, and it does not get replenished into the ground and into the streams and the aquifers and the lakes and rivers as fast as it's being consumed. So that means that we could very seriously be facing a water crisis in the very near future. And in some places we already are.
The drought conditions across south central Kentucky are continuing to worsen, and now one community is taking emergency action. Officials in Liberty say the city has just a few months before they run out of water.
Mayor Haddad says the city has been asking residents to conserve water for months. But now officials say voluntary conservation isn't enough.
The executive order is already causing some businesses to cease operations because they cannot abide by the regulations and remain open.
With less water available, some farmers may have to scale back operations, reducing their harvest and hurting their bottom line.
Tonight, a water crisis mounting in Corpus Christi, Texas, where drone video shows docks once surrounded by water, now sitting on dry land.
This is unprecedented territory.
Droughts have been crippling this area for years. Now local officials are warning the city's reservoirs are on track to run dry by next year. This week, revealing plans to potentially declare a water emergency that as soon as September would force all local residents and businesses to cut usage by 25%. All while big questions loom about the area's largest water consumers, 20 major industrial facilities who officials say consume more than half of Corpus Christi's water.
A new report finds data centers powering artificial intelligence are putting a strain on the Great Lakes. The report by the environmental group Alliance for the Great Lakes questions whether the Great Lakes can support these big data centers. Last year, Michigan lawmakers authorized new tax breaks to lure these types of AI businesses in. But the report finds an average facility can use more than 1 million gallons of water daily. Now consider this, only 1% of the water in the Great Lakes is replenished by rain, snow, and groundwater.
Now to a moment of reckoning in the drought-stricken West. The nation's largest 2 reservoirs, Lake Mead near Las Vegas and Lake Powell in southern Utah, have fallen to their lowest levels on record.
The deepening water crisis has reached an impasse. The hope was Western states would agree on how to divide the Colorado River. That has not happened. And now the water is running out, and soon the federal government could take over control.
Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the nation's 2 largest reservoirs, have fallen to their lowest combined levels on record, both less than 30% full. California, Arizona, and Nevada have offered to cut their use by about 1.6 million acre feet a year for the next 2 years, roughly 500 billion gallons. But federal officials are considering cuts nearly twice that amount. It would mean higher costs for cities trying to secure water, tighter restrictions on outdoor watering, and major changes for farmers.
If it comes down to a conflict of municipalities and residents versus data centers are going to win. They have a lot more pull than we do. They have a lot more money than we do.
And a lot of people will argue against this and say, well, the planet's made up of like 70% water. That is true. But the amount of actual drinking water, available drinking water for us that we can consume is like 0.5%. So that is the water that they are actually focusing on. That's what they're consuming. They're not consuming ocean water because you would have to desalinate it. They're going for the stuff that is readily available. And that just happens to be the same stuff that we rely on for our drinking water. So we're now at a point with these data centers where instead of it being conserve the environment, it's like, we don't care about the environment. We don't care about the water. We don't care about anything. Let's put these data centers in. Let's destroy the farms. Let's take up all the rural land that once we use up, we'll never get back. The food doesn't matter. The water doesn't matter. None of this stuff that we rely on, that we depend on, and that is, I mean, seriously for our survival, suddenly does not matter. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why are these data centers so important? This isn't even about AI itself. It's just about the data centers because, again, we have thousands more data centers than any other country. And these other countries have AI, so it's not like we need it for AI. What is the actual reason that these data centers matter so much? What is the actual reason that we need so many and we have to build them so big and we are okay with allowing them to consume our resources, the things that we need to survive? And where this gets even crazier is that when you look at all these data centers that are being built, and especially these really big ones, these things are shrouded in so much secrecy that whenever they're going to be built, a lot of times they're just like the construction company comes in there and they start building these data centers and the public doesn't even know until the shovel is in the dirt. There are no public hearings. There is no public discourse. The public is not informed. It is this giant non-disclosure agreement that is signed with the local authorities, and they allow these companies to come in there. A lot of times they don't even know who the company is. They don't know the full scale and the scope of the data center or the project, and they go to town. They start building these things. And because there's so much secrecy around this now, there are communities that are rising up and that are pushing back very, very strongly, which is leading to more public discourse, which is a great thing. But even when they have this public discourse, a lot of times the public will be up in arms about it. There will be hundreds or thousands of people that show up. Sometimes they push them out of the public hearing, and then they'll put a projector up on the wall and they'll allow the public to watch it without actually being involved in the conversation. And even though the public is completely opposed to it, they will approve it anyway. That's not the case every single time, but it does happen. And that is leading to more and more outrage.
Well, the public was notified of this data center coming to their community just last Tuesday. They say they feel that they didn't have a chance to share their concerns before this development was ultimately signed off on.
All you're going to do is lie. You're wasting everyone's time.
TerraWolf is the company bringing this data center to Boyd County, and Boyd County Judge Executive Eric Cheney says they had to sign an NDA and were not able to release any information to the public until the company did.
What's not in the document? The name of the company.
If this company wants to build in our community, don't you think that we should know who they are? Why is it such a secret?
The city of Piqua told the I-Team the identity of the company is subject to a non-disclosure agreement and is expected to be announced by the company in 2026. City documents the I-Team got only identify the company as J5 LLC doing business as Shatura LLC. State corporation records the I-Team pulled showed the business formed here in Ohio this summer. The I-Team uncovered data center non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, beyond Piqua. We filed open records requests for the agreement between Google and a Georgia county. All references to water use specifics to water requirements throughout the document are blacked out, a secret.
Last spring, the grocers were offered more than $8 million to sell all 250 acres of their land. That's 35 times what they bought it for in 1988.
This is a good amount of money.
Yeah, but I don't really care how much they offer. I'm just not telling.
When they asked for details about the project, they were given an NDA instead.
The mystery guy slides a paper forward and says, sign this non-disclosure agreement and we'll start answering questions. And we said, well, that's a non-starter.
County officials telling NBC News they signed non-disclosure agreements with the same company last spring, hoping to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in investment from one of the top 5 tech companies in the U.S. building out its AI infrastructure. They agreed to keep the company's name secret. But for the grocers, the silence rang louder than the money.
How does that make you feel?
Handcuffed. I mean, I think they're trying to, protect the potential company from us.
It's all going to be a done deal before we can do anything about it.
Experts studying data center projects like this one across the country say this kind of secrecy isn't accidental, it's strategic.
They're using these agreements to try and grease the skids and try and avoid, to the extent that they can, that community input that could slow things down.
But already in Mason County, the community is giving its input after online Facebook groups pieced together what was coming to their town.
What's out there they don't want us to know. If they were totally transparent, they wouldn't need the NDAs.
It leaves everybody in this county not knowing what they're up against. That's how I feel.
At this zoning meeting, frustrations boiling over.
NDA, no discernible accountability.
Construction chaos and hazards, air, water, noise pollution, water quality, pressure issues, possible electric grid issues as well. This is something that has got to be more open.
And the residents of Mason County are not alone. Data center construction is booming nationwide to fuel the growing demand for artificial intelligence, with hundreds of new projects announced last year alone. We found more than 20 cases across 16 states where NDAs were signed between local officials and data center developers. Many of them look similar to this NDA from a town in Minnesota, saying the company should be given a reasonable opportunity to prevent disclosure of the confidential information. 6 of the largest tech companies building data centers across the country all declined to comment or did not respond to questions about the use of NDAs in data center projects. For the grocers, no details meant no deal. But Mason County officials tell us 18 of the 20 people approached did sign property purchase agreements.
But this leads to the question, why are these people willing to put the communities and the people and everything at risk to make sure that these data centers can be installed? And when I say the communities are put at risk, I mean in pretty much every way possible, because when these data centers are installed, they're installed around or near a lot of these communities, which drives people out of their homes because of this droning noise that makes people sick.
One community in southwest Michigan has been experiencing the reality of a data center next door for a couple of years now, and they say the sound has changed their lives. What would you say to people who've never experienced this for themselves?
It sounds like someone set up a vacuum, like in your living room, and the vacuum is just, that thing needs to be cleaned. Like the filter is clogged up, so it's a high pitch whining, and they just left it on and walked out.
You've seen movies and stuff where they have somebody in a cell torture them with sound, and that's basically what it is.
For months, Hyperscale Data has been touting plans for expansion, despite city leaders saying they were left in the dark and that no expansion permits had been submitted. Last week, at the invitation of Dowagiac's mayor, the CEO of Hyperscale Data, William Horn, spoke directly to city residents at a special council meeting. Horn explained that the company plans to invest $100 million to expand AI computing and advanced robotics at the facility.
If they still aren't happy and feel that their home isn't enjoyable, then we'll buy their property from them.
Dozens of residents spoke out passionately at the meeting, none in support of Hyperscale.
Why didn't you consider the residents when the noise continues to get louder and louder and louder?
The bottom line here is that you are not your neighbors. Your business is sneaky, uncooperative with local ordinances.
I wanted to know more about what the science says when it comes to data center sound, so I reached out to Rick Neitzel, professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Michigan.
When it comes to these data centers being built all around our area and around the country, are you concerned when it comes to sound?
I am. This is kind of an unprecedented new noise source that's being introduced into a lot of communities. We now know pretty definitively that noise in communities at high enough levels is associated with things like high blood pressure, heart attacks, stroke.
There are farmers now that are reporting that since data centers moved into the area that their farm is near, that they now have 0 live births. So when their livestock have babies, the babies come out stillborn. They're just not alive. And we have to ask ourselves, if it's doing that to the livestock, what is it doing to the people? And another thing it's doing to the people, besides driving down their property values and driving them out of their communities, it's also putting them in a very bad financial strain, because a lot of times when these data centers go in, it raises the price of utilities, water and electric, substantially. It could be as much as a couple 100% in the areas immediately around these data centers, but the water and electric bills for the entire country is going up. And that is mostly because of these data centers.
New data centers are driving up utility bills in at least 13 states. This analysis found Americans who live near data centers are paying as much as 267% more for energy than 5 years ago.
Quiet Country Living brought families like father and son Tim and Andy Grosser to these rolling hills in Mason County, Kentucky.
They just want to be out in the country where it's quiet and they can watch the wildlife.
They've tended to cattle and hunted here for more than 30 years. But now that quiet is under threat from a $1 billion data center project that could soon rise just over that ridge.
I don't want any part of it being anywhere near here.
Why?
For one, I don't want to look at it. Our power is going to double in price, and we don't have enough energy right now to even supply Maysville through the winter. They have to buy power from the grid.
And a lot of times these data centers, they get massive breaks on water and utility bills. They get massive tax breaks, which means that they are actually paying less in a lot of cases than the residents that live in these communities and that have lived in these communities. And you want to talk about a smack in the face. That is absolutely terrible.
Data centers are actually paying less for electricity than
Far
residents.
less.
And you know, another crazy thing about this is that there are basically 0 regulations around these data centers right now. It's kind of like the Wild Wild West. They're just letting them come in and do whatever they want. And a lot of times when they come in and do whatever they want, they're running these giant gas turbines. It's basically these jet engines, which are these massive generators, which produces all of this heat and all of these emissions. And it's this horrible noise that people have to deal with 24/7.
Last year, VoltaGrid and Server Farm applied to essentially create a power plant right next door to an under construction data center. But as the process was going through review, evidence shows they started construction anyway. Along Hazelbrand Road in Newton County sit generators in construction that shouldn't be there.
And it popped up out of the ground just, felt like overnight.
The project is the first of its kind in Georgia, a data center with essentially its own private power plant built right next door. But first, the project needed a permit. Maurice Carter is the president of Sustainable Newton. He opposes the plan that calls for the building of 33 natural gas engines and 37 diesel emergency generators because they worry it could pollute the air with cancer-causing chemicals.
We were in the middle of that process. None of those questions had been legally resolved yet, and yet here they appear to be building this.
And again, we have to come back to the question about why does the environment no longer matter? Why are we willing to allow for all of this pollution and all of this heat exchange? Because for the longest time, we're talking decades, we were harped on about global warming, about climate change. And now there's this massive contradiction where these data centers are going against all of that stuff. So does climate change no longer matter? Is climate change no longer a thing? Is global warming no longer a concern? Are we no longer worried about emissions or anything like that? Because I remember just a couple years ago where they were talking about culling livestock in several countries. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of cows because cows were supposedly destroying the environment because they were producing too much methane. And they were storming these farms and these, all these rural communities and stuff, talking about getting rid of their cows. And there was so much pushback by the communities because of this stuff. And if they're willing to go to those lengths over something that walks around in a field and eats grass, why all of a sudden are data centers okay? when you have jet engines that are no longer in the sky, now they're in the sky and on the ground, and they're causing all of these emissions to come out. They're causing all of this heat to be produced into the environment. They're causing all of these things that would, according to them, lead to global warming and lead to climate change. But suddenly, apparently that's not a thing anymore. And it just doesn't seem to matter. And while we're on the topic of the environment, this gets even crazier, okay? Because not only are these data centers using these generators, which are burning, fossil fuels, and they're using coal-burning fuel in the form of power plants and stuff like that, they're also now talking about, actually they're not talking about, they're doing this, okay? The FCC just approved space mirrors. And if you haven't heard about this, basically what this is, there's a startup, and they go by the name of Reflect Orbital, and their plan is to, by 2035, launch and release over 50,000 mirror satellites into orbit so that we can light up the night sky. And this year, the FCC approved them to launch their first satellite and to test it out. And from the first satellite, then they'll put 5 up there, and then 50, and then 500, and then 5,000. And they will scale this up until there are over 50,000 of these satellites that are literally these giant mirrors that they can control and reflect the sunlight to any area they want.
FCC has approved plans by a Hawthorne-based startup to test a satellite that would use a 60-foot mirror to then reflect sunlight back to planet Earth after dark. Reflect Orbital says that it would power solar farms, provide light for rescue workers, and illuminate city streets. The idea here is to have access to the sun on demand and when it's needed. Reflect Orbital plans to have more than 50,000 satellites in action by 2035. However, some astronomers, wildlife experts, and others oppose this idea completely. They claim that the light from the mirrors could distract airplane pilots, could wreak havoc on astronomical observations, and interfere with sleep-wake cycles.
And they're painting this as a great thing that, you can go out at midnight and you can lay out by the pool and you can rent an hour of sunlight in the dead of night, and they'll be able to light up construction sites and all these great things. But in the fine print, and when you really look into this, one of the big reasons they want to do this and what they're going to be using it for is so that they can light up all these solar farms at nighttime. The solar farms that power these AI data centers.
Our first satellites will be able to deliver a full moon of brightness for about 5 minutes. That's demonstrating the technology so we can learn about it and then build a constellation out after that.
He has high hopes for that future fleet to help with things like nighttime emergency rescues, and eventually to turn a profit, charge $5,000 an hour to get a single mirror fanned out and pointed at the customer's target.
We'll also be able to, light up farms, grow plants, light up solar farms, produce clean electricity.
But launching the space mirrors is igniting plenty of controversy.
Listen, we don't want a private company or private individual deciding whether we're going to obliterate nighttime in my backyard.
Dark Sky, one of the world's leading advocates for protecting natural darkness, says light pollution would degrade the environment, interfere with space research, escalate the dangers of space junk, and disrupt the circadian rhythm of all living things on Earth.
There will be tremendous environmental impacts.
The FCC's policy says anything in space is extraterritorial and not in the jurisdiction of the United States, meaning impacts are not subject to environmental review.
And Meta has actually just announced in a press release that they have begun plans to power their AI data centers with sunlight beamed from space. All right, this is a separate company. And they're going to be launching these solar collecting satellites, and they're going to beam sunlight back to the Earth's surface to help support the rising energy demands of their company's rapidly expanding AI infrastructure. And their plan is to start testing in 2028, and they're going to scale up by 2030. Now, this sounds bad enough on the surface, because I'm sure reflecting light back to the Earth's surface at nighttime and disrupting the entire Earth's natural rhythm is going to be bad enough on the wildlife and migration patterns and all these species that rely on, these actual natural cycles to basically function. So it's going to be bad enough in terms of that. But these mirrors also reflect back 80 to 88%, and in some cases even more, of the heat from the sun. And that is reflected back in the form of thermal radiation, infrared. So they're basically heating the planet 24/7. Instead of having a cool-off period at nighttime, we're going to have all of these satellites orbiting the Earth that are going to be warming the planet night and day. So again, it all comes back to the question about why is there this massive contradiction between AI data centers and what's been shoved down our throats for the last couple decades about global warming and climate change. And that is, of course, not the only thing they're putting into space, because another crazy thing about this, as if it couldn't get much crazier, is the fact that a SpaceX FCC filing said that it plans to put over 1 million satellites into orbit to build an orbital data center system. All right, this is absolutely crazy. And basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to just fill our sky with all of this technology, because it doesn't just stop there, okay? There's another piece to this. Jeff Bezos is also getting into the game, and he is going to be putting over 51,600 satellites called Project Sunrise that are set to operate in a sun synchronous orbit. And there's already a lot of stuff up there. There are over 11,000 Starlink satellites alone, plus all the other satellites that are floating around up there from us and other countries. And when it comes to Starlink, there are going to be over 42,000 when they're done putting those in orbit. So we have to ask ourselves, what is that going to do to us? What's it going to do to our environment? What's it going to do to our night sky? What's it going to do to the wildlife and all the things that rely on senses that we don't really have? Because you have to imagine that with all of this technology that's basically circling the globe, it has to be releasing some form of EMF. It has to be having some kind of impact on us and the planet. It would not make sense that it wouldn't have an impact on us and the planet. But apparently, that doesn't matter. And SpaceX is so involved in this idea of putting satellites in orbit to build AI data centers that they have a gigasat factory planned in Barstrup, Texas, which is going to be over 1,000 acres. And that is going to allow them to have over 11 million square feet of manufacturing space to produce these orbiting AI data centers. So they're basically building a giant network in the sky. Network in the sky. Skynet. Skynet. Where have we heard that before? And there probably actually is something to these naming conventions, which we're going to get into that also. But, you know, it's kind of crazy when you think about this, because when you have all of this technology swarming the planet, there will not be a single square inch on this planet that anyone can go to escape it. And when it comes to the places that they're putting these AI data centers, it seems that they know no bounds. There is no place off limits, because now they're building these AI tents. And there are already several of these in Ohio and Tennessee. They can be built in as quickly as 2 to 3 weeks. They are water cooled, and they of course use jet engines, turbine generators to power them. Because again, who cares about emissions, right? And they're also now talking about putting AI data centers in the ocean. There is a $140 million investment to power AI data centers at sea. The funding is going to a renewable energy and ocean technology company, and it is backed by former PayPal CEO and Palantir co-founder Peter Thiel. And that startup is already worth over $1 billion. So they are very serious about putting these AI data centers in pretty much every single place on this planet. And when it comes to putting these things in the ocean, what is that going to do to the marine life? And this is something else to think about. Fish is also a big food source for humans. So how is that going to affect us? How is the heat exchange going to affect the warmth of the ocean? Which, oh, by the way, they've been talking about the melting ice caps and the rising sea levels for how many years now? Now all of a sudden they're going to be putting AI data centers in the ocean, which will have heat exchange and which will warm the ocean up. But suddenly, we don't care. That doesn't matter anymore. The ice caps are no longer melting. That's no longer a concern. Don't look over there. Nothing to see here. The hypocrisy and the contradictions are truly maddening. Nothing adds up. Nothing makes sense. And that brings us to perhaps one of the most profound questions and important questions of this entire discussion, which is, what exactly are these data centers for? Not what is AI for, because we've kind of talked about that before, and a lot of people have talked about that ad nauseum, but we're talking about what are these data centers actually for? Because again, the common theme and the common narrative is that they're simply for AI. They're for us or whoever masters AI so that they can basically obtain global control, or, they're for surveillance and all this tyrannical stuff. But what are they actually for? This is where I went out and I looked at the communities, and I looked at what the people are saying. I looked at what y'all are saying. And what I found is kind of crazy. And this is where you might want to put on your tinfoil hat. You might want to have an open mind, because I'm not saying that any of this stuff is true, but when you really think about a lot of this stuff, it's kind of wild, because some of it actually does make a lot of sense. So here's a big one that I heard a lot of people talk about. And I want to start with this one, because when I say a lot of people are talking about it, I'm talking about dozens, if not hundreds of people across several platforms I looked at were talking about this one thing. And they were talking about the fact that, is it possible that these data centers are consuming resources, they're consuming water specifically, and they're funneling that to these giant underground bunkers? Maybe because there's some sort of cataclysm that is on the way that we're not privy to. So they're using these AI data centers as a front to just consume resources. Maybe that's why none of this other stuff matters. Maybe that's why the water crisis doesn't matter. Maybe that's why global warming no longer matters. Maybe that's why nothing matters, except consuming the water and putting it where it is going to be needed and where it's going to be used for some type of global event that apparently will be very catastrophic. And of course, there's no real evidence to back this up, but with the amount of water that they're saying these data centers are using, to the point that it's causing a global water crisis, we have to wonder, where's all that water going? And I think that question is what has sparked this theory. That is kind of what's led to people thinking that maybe they're consuming the water or storing it so that it can be used for something else. And maybe it's not being used for the bunkers that these billionaires are building. Maybe it's not being used for these giant underground cities that we are now finally being made aware of, but maybe it's being used for something else. Another theory I found online that people were talking about that some people think is a possibility is that these data centers are being built as giant fronts, and they're actually going to be used as giant prisons or camps, if you know what I mean. Now, I couldn't find any evidence to back this up, so I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but just kind of keep it in the back of your mind that some people are talking about this and they think it is a possibility. Now, there's another one that really got me thinking. And this one might sound kind of crazy on the surface, but the more I looked into this and the more I thought about it, the more I thought this was a very, very real possibility. The idea behind this theory is that AI data centers are going to be used to open up some sort of parallel universe. And this is where the naming convention kind of becomes a little profound, because what is the big AI initiative called? It is called the Stargate Project, or Project Stargate.
Together, these world-leading technology giants are announcing the formation of Stargate. So put that name down in your books, because I think you're going to hear a lot about it.
What was the CIA initiative called back in the mid-1900s, where they used to do remote viewing? It was called Project Stargate. So why is it that the biggest initiative in the world here in the United States is called Project Stargate? I mean, think about a lot of the movies and TV shows that have come out. Back in the mid-1990s, there was a movie with Kurt Russell called Stargate. Recently, there's a TV show called, I think, Stargate SG-1. And I think if Hollywood and these movies and TV shows have proved anything over the years, it's that sometimes they are predictive programming. Sometimes it's a form of them telling us what they're doing. So I guess that brings up another big question. Are these data centers going to be used to open up a Stargate? Is that why they're calling it Project Stargate? I personally have no idea, but it definitely gets my wheels turning and it makes me think. And I want to know what y'all think about this stuff too, because the last theory is also a little crazy, but I could see where this one also makes sense, because there's been some people that have come out that have actually worked on the construction projects for some of these data centers, and they have talked about how the walls on these data centers are reinforced steel, and it's layers and layers of basically reinforcements, to the point that they were talking about how it seemed like they were building them to withstand cataclysm, that they weren't built like traditional warehouses, they were built more like vaults, like they were way more reinforced than they should be. And I saw some people pushing back on that, and they were saying, well, it's just to prevent, EMF and stuff from coming in and out of the building. It's more or less a giant insulator, if you want to call it that. But the more I heard people talking about this, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I don't know what's true. Nothing really makes sense. But tying this into all the other theories that are out there, the reinforcement in these data centers really makes me wonder. And it makes me wonder, what is the true reason for all of this reinforcement? What's the true reason for all this secrecy? What's the reason for the size and the quantity? And why is there so much contradiction? I, for one, could draw all the conclusions in the world, but I have no idea. I am left with more questions than answers. And that's why I want to know what y'all think. Now that we have all this information in one place, and I'm sure there's plenty more, but based on what we know right now, what are we to make of all this? What are the answers to these questions? Does anyone have any idea? Share your thoughts, and let's start this discussion and see if we can collectively get to the bottom of it.